Howdy, folks. Let me set the scene for you with some historical particulars. Henry goes along with this new identity as a way to survive. It seemed clear that the old man's cheese had slid off his biscuit. That woman was so ugly. Howdy, folks. Welcome to the premiere episode of How the West Was Read. I'm Sass, self-proclaimed book nerd, history enthusiast, and digital creator of sorts, and I will be your guide for this expedition. Now, truth be told, I tarried over whether to begin this series with James McBride's fictional novel, The Good Lord Bird, but upon finishing the Showtime miniseries, I was steadfast in my decision. One of the reasons I'd hesitated was because the Goodreads categorization for the book included the genres of historical fiction, African American, and Civil War, but only 19 people had categorized the book as a Western. When I think of the Western genre in popular media, I think of John Wayne, John Ford, and Larry McMurtry. We'll get to them at some point in this series, but I expect you can see the common denominators and understand why, when I encountered a Western novel written by an African American author, it gave me pause. So, with my curiosity piqued and notions readjusted, I reckoned I ought to introduce us all to Mr. McBride. James McBride is the best-selling author of The Color of Water and Miracle at St. Anna, and he was the recipient of the National Book Award for The Good Lord Bird in 2013. The latter is the first encounter I have had with his writing, but I can tell you it won't be the last. Osawatomie, Kansas Territory, 1855 to 1858. During this time, Kansas experienced a period of violence between pro- and anti-slavery settlers that would later come to be known as Bleedin, Kansas. Let me set the scene for you with some historical particulars. You see, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was passed to prohibit the expansion of slavery in the lands west of the 36th parallel, which included what would become the states of Kansas and Nebraska. This legislation admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state, while admitting Maine as a free state, thus trying to balance the North's desire to prevent the expansion of slavery, while also appeasing the South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, however, effectively repealed that compromise by instituting a policy called popular sovereignty. This meant that it would be the citizens of these territories and not the U.S. Congress who would get to decide on the question of slavery. This led to an influx of pro- and anti-slavery settlers to the Kansas Territory, with each group trying to further their cause. It's against this backdrop that The Good Lord Bird takes place. The story is narrated from the viewpoint of Henry Shackleford, a young slave boy living in the Kansas Territory. Henry is about 12 years old, and he and his pa work in their master's tavern. On one fateful day, the legendary abolitionist John Brown, who is in the territory to confront the pro-slavery crowd, arrives at the tavern. And let's just say things go awry. Henry winds up fleeing with Brown and joining his crew, which includes some of Brown's sons and a revolving cast of characters. The running gag of the story is, when Brown first encounters Henry at the tavern, he misidentifies Henry as a girl. Henry goes along with this new identity as a way to survive and passes as Henrietta, but he is mostly called by the nickname Onion, which Brown gives to him after a comical misunderstanding. Over the course of the story, Henry finds himself a participant to history, including Brown's infamous raid on the U.S. Arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859. John Brown was an abolitionist leader of evangelical Christian faith who believed he was being utilized by God as an instrument to bring about the end of slavery in the United States. By the 1850s, Brown believed that the time for pacifism and talking was over, and that violence would be necessary to end slavery. He led raids with his small army and was feared throughout Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri. Throughout his campaign, Brown met with black abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and he wrote letters to raise funds for the abolitionist cause. The Showtime adaptation of the book takes place over 7 episodes. The miniseries was executive produced by Ethan Hawke, who also stars as John Brown, and James McBride served as an executive producer. Joshua Caleb Johnson played Onion. Now, I read the novel first and found the story so engaging that I immediately followed up by watching the show. The humorous elements of the book were a pleasant surprise, given the heaviness of the subject matter, but that was the precise intent of James McBride. A passage from the book that made me flip out of my saddle was the following, in which Onion first meets Miss Abby, the owner of the Pikesville Hotel, for the first time. She was wearing a long white face scarf round her neck. Atop that neck was a face with enough powder on it to pack the barrel of a cannon. Her lips was thick and painted red and clamped a cigar between them. Her forehead was high and her face was flushed red and curdled in anger like old cheese. That woman was so ugly. She looked like a death threat. In one of the bonus interviews for the series, McBride stated that the story is so hard to tell that the only way to tell it, really, is with humor.
Race is really hard to talk about for all of us. The story here is meant to make you smile and think. When some things are so bad, you have to laugh at them. That's what makes good stories.
I thought the show was well cast, and while there were a few deviations from the text, overall I thought they did a fine job bringing the story to life. Ethan Hawke brought an emotional intelligence to John Brown's character that wasn't as pronounced in the book. It was clear that the literary John Brown was unwavering in his convictions, even if that meant utilizing violence to bring about change. That unyieldingness made him come off as recklessly delusional. For example, when Brown tells others of his plan to raid Harper's Ferry, even his most ardent supporters have doubts. As Onion puts it, it seemed clear that the old man's cheese had slid off his biscuit. Hawks John Brown had a self-awareness to go along with his militancy, which I would argue made him seem at least rationally delusional. I thought Joshua Caleb Johnson captured the naivete and candor of Onion, which brought most of the humor to the storytelling. My favorite character, however, was Bob, played by Hubert Point du Jour. His deadpan delivery and facial expressions were even better than how I read Bob's character. After reading the book and watching the series, I was left with a lot of thoughts percolating in my mind. For starters, John Brown is one of the untold heroes of American history, and my reading and viewing experiences inspired me to do further research into his story and share it with you. During his time, Brown was regarded by mainstream America as a traitor, although many African Americans viewed him as a hero of their cause. In present day, some historians view Brown's actions at Harper's Ferry as the inciting incident of the American Civil War, which would break out a year and a half later. His actions stoked the consciousness of Northern white America in regards to the atrocities of slavery, because Brown was a white man who was willing to put his life on the line for black folks. Being that The Good Lord Bird is essentially a story about the fight against slavery, I would be remiss if I did not mention the most obvious ism, which is racism. The biggest ism I want to address, however, is classism. This was shaped by the economic disparities between the northern and southern states. Unlike the South, the more industrialized North had a diversified economy that did not rest squarely on the labor and profits from slavery. As such, many folks in the North viewed slavery as the South's problem. That attitude played out differently for the free and enslaved black folks who were affected by slavery. Many enslaved black folks did not want to risk the dangers of a rebellion or an escape attempt. Many free black folks in the northern states and Canada were willing to talk about slavery, but not literally fight against it.
My name's Harriet Tubman, and you sitting on the doorstep of change. Walk through it.
The depiction of black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, played by Daveed Diggs, as a leader who lived in opulence and who was always ready to speechify for the anti-slavery cause, but not necessarily take up arms, epitomized this kind of respectable activism. The gender-switching storyline is one that will come up again in this series. From what I've been reading, it appears that girls and women were often the ones to pass as males. This could be due to the lack of, death, and/or incapacitation of their male relatives, in which case these females would disguise themselves as males in order to earn money and conduct business. I could not find any interviews in which James McBride addresses the reason for John Brown's misgendering of Onion. I did notice that in the miniseries, it was made clear that John Brown had always known that Onion was a boy. Whether the gender switching was purely part of the comedic relief and/or larger social commentary, I can only speculate. Onion, for his part, was inclined to take advantage of passing as a girl because it kept him from the front lines of battle, but he could not escape the notion that he should be a man and fight like a man for the freedom of his people. I thoroughly enjoyed The Good Lord Bird and rated both the book and miniseries 5 out of 5 gold pieces. Before I take my leave, I want to thank you for watching. I'd be much obliged if you'd like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It is rough algorithmic terrain out there, and I do have a long way to travel. If you have read and or watched The Good Lord Bird, mosey on down to that there comments section and speak on it. Don't be a stranger now. Until next time.